First off, everyone needs to listen to your podcast. I think you guys are probably my most favorite industry podcast out there because you guys really teach actors how to actually be entrepreneurs, how to actually market themselves. So I also do feel like every actor should think of themselves as a business person.
Good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you are in the world, or beyond. Did you go to space with Gayle King? It won't be timely by the time you're hearing this because I'm recording this months ahead. But that was fascinating, wasn't it? Oh, capitalism at its finest, folks. Katy Perry and Gayle King in space. Welcome to today's episode of Creative Risk. I'm super excited for today's episode because it is featuring my friend and colleague Jennifer Ashley Tepper, who is the author of Women Writing Musicals: The Legacy That the History Books Left Out, which is the first ever book about female musical theater writers. She has also authored the Untold Stories of Broadway book series, and Tepper is the creative and programming director of 54 Below and conceiver of the Jonathan Larson Project, which she produced off-Broadway. She was historian consultant on the Tick, Tick, Boom movie, producer of the Broadway musical Be More Chill, and co-creator of the Bistro award-winning concert series If It Only Ever Runs a Minute. Other Broadway credits include title of show. She is prolific. She's prolific and she's my age, 26. No, she really is. We are the same age, 26, and sort of have grown up alongside each other in different facets of the industry, having sort of our paths crossed a couple of times. But I'm so taken with her and all that she's created and continues to create. And I had the chance to see her presentation on her new book, Women Writing Musicals, at the New York Public Library. And she's just so smart and thorough and considerate and positive and funny. And I'm so excited for you to hear this episode because she's the real deal. And, I didn't say this to her, but I want you all to hear it. In a lot of ways, Jennifer, as a theater historian and producer, and she talks a little bit about this in the episode, is, well, what's that job? What's that job? And we as artists, a lot of times, struggle to figure out what's our in, how we're going to find our in. But I would argue it's even harder for someone like Jennifer because she just had this deep, deep passion and yet has made herself invaluable over and over and over again in so many different scenarios with so many different people. So I think it's an interesting even retrospective on that, especially through that lens of artist sustainability. So hope you enjoy. Without further ado, Jennifer Ashley Tepper. I was laughing, though, because I'm not sure if you know who Jeffrey Self is, but Jeffrey's just came out with a book called Self-Sabotage. And yeah. I was telling my partner, I was like, I'm looking around at these people my age who've all written books. And I'm feeling very unaccomplished.
An amazing book. Your book is coming, and you have to write it. Yes.
Okay. But I'm just saying, I'm like between Jen and Jeffrey, what's happening here? I'm feeling very behind.
Honestly, fake cigarette though. Like we're not that young anymore. I don't know. I know. Like get on. No, I'm just kidding.
Low
Tough
key,
love.
high
But
key.
no, your book is going to be amazing when you write it.
Okay, with you of all, I like to ask this question of people, but with you of all people, I'm especially curious about the beginning, specifically what bug bit you, and when you realized, it might have been one and the same or down the road, that you were going to dedicate your life to this.
Yeah. I think that like my family, for being people that didn't ever work professionally in theater, have a lot of theater in their bones. My dad is currently in town visiting from Florida, and I was reminded last night that he hears a word and immediately bursts into a musical theater song with that word in it. So Even though I come from a family of like doctors, my mom's an occupational therapist, everyone in my family is like a pharmacist, a scientist. I was taken to the theater really young. My grandparents and my parents loved the theater. I was encouraged to go to theater camp. I like from a very young age was obsessed with cast recordings, and it was all nurtured during my childhood by my family. So I just became really obsessed with learning everything I could about theater from the moment that I kind of first saw A Chorus Line and Fiddler on the Roof and did Annie at summer camp. I was like, I want to learn more. I want to know what else these people wrote. I want to know like where these shows were. I was really curious about the actual art form very early on.
And were there ever clues that early on, even, that you were going to be documenting theater history? So like you talk about the learning, which I was there too. Like I was always at the flea markets and reading the things, but we did specifically documenting, because you know what I've referred to you as the other day, and I think I came up with the title for the episode, Broadway's living archive. That's like sort of how I was calling you.
I'm
And
obsessed with that.
and I want to talk about later on the art of researching a bit, because I think that that's kind of something that's an art unto itself. But specifically, were there any clues that you were going to be documenting this heavily?
Definitely. And it's such a good question. Because I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, and not anywhere near New York, I was studying theater from afar. And so I was putting on my theater historian brain before I even realized what that was, learning about all of it from like liner notes and books. And I subscribed to Time Out New York before I'd ever even been to New York to just like learn what was playing at each theater. And so I think that there was that element of it. And then also, I went to the same local theater summer camp for 10 years. And I was always the one that was like, you guys have to learn this new musical, and like burning CDs for people and going, oh, have you heard of this writer? And so it was me like being obsessed with it in all of these ways that just manifested in like fangirling. And then also like growing up, I feel like I was always a historian of the local theater that I was doing. Like I could tell you who played what show. Like I could kind of commemorate any memory that was like a personal memory. Like again, at the theater camp I went to for 10 years, I could have told you like what show they did and who played what for like all the years before I went there. It was just always kind of a part of my brain. And again, what's so funny about it is like sometimes people meet my dad and they're like, oh, even though your dad's a doctor, like a song plays on the radio and he's like, this is where I was when that song came out, and like this is like what was going on in America when this song came out. So the historian brain is somehow genetic.
And you went to NYU and for dramatic writing, I believe.
Yes, good research.
So what role does that nonfiction work, right, play in your life as a writer and historian today? And are you working on, or have you thought about working on any creative work in that specific way?
Yeah, what's so funny is like when I trace it back, I was like New Yorker bust, and I only applied to NYU. I was really like gung ho on NYU, and I said if I didn't get in, I would just like reapply until I did and chain myself to my bedroom in Boca Raton. So it was NYU or bust. And for me, I really wanted to be at Tisch. Like I really knew I wanted to be among theater artists. So it wasn't like a create your own major situation. And there was no real perfect place for me, And so because I loved theater and I loved writing, I was like, oh, dramatic writing will be a great place for me. And then I ended up in a department full of people that wanted to be screenwriters and TV writers and playwrights, which wasn't what I wanted to do. But it ended up being, really wonderful to be surrounded by that. And, for my thesis in college, I adapted Ted Chapin's book, Everything Was Possible, into a really bad screenplay that I've never let him read, despite him asking. But it was my way of saying, okay, like I'm going to take theater history and figure out how to learn more about dramatizing theater history through what my major is. And I think that maybe the most beneficial thing, though, about being in a place that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do was that it did make me seek out my own opportunities. It did make me like, assign my own books to myself and try to like learn what I could from like internships I sought out and volunteer opportunities and just like figure out how I could supplement my education through my own initiative, which like truly planted things in me that served me so well later, just about like creating your own work. And I did a lot of my own stuff on campus because my department wasn't exactly what I wanted to learn. And And at the same time, like giving feedback to other writers in class and, workshopping people's plays and things like that, it definitely all served like what I have been doing and that eventual goal. And what's so funny, and I guess I'm hopping around a little bit, is I've never wanted to write a musical. Like, I feel like it's that thing where you love baseball so much and you're like a coach, and so you would never be a player. Like, that's the worst metaphor ever because I don't know anything about sports, but it's like that. I've never really wanted to write a musical. But when I was writing my book, Women Writing Musicals, I did include conceivers as, it's like lyricists, composers, librettists, and conceivers are one of the, categories. And then when I was doing the Jonathan Larson Project, I was like, oh, I obviously didn't write this musical, but I conceived it. I'm the conceiver. And so technically I would fall into that category that I made myself for my book. So I guess technically, like, I am a woman that creates or created a musical, but not exactly a musical theater writer.
Well, but given, and I want to talk about some of the works you've produced, Be More Chill, Broadway Bounty Hunter, etc. But when and of course the Jonathan Larson Project. But when you're working on these new musicals as a producer, and I'm correct me if I'm wrong, as creative director at 54 Below, I imagine that simply understanding dramatic structure well is a very helpful tool in communicating with artists about the shows that you're trying to build together.
Exactly. And I honestly feel like everyone can benefit from getting into any other corner of what they're doing. I often wish that like I had more experience like designing when I was in school, even like in high school and college. I think anytime you can do something hands-on that is like a category of someone you're going to be collaborating with later, it makes you a better collaborator. So all of it just helps one to like understand, each other's jobs.
Well, in fact, let's briefly talk about this in relation to the Jonathan Larson Project, which I was not able to see, and I'm bummed about it because Bill Finn, Jonathan Larson, who, and I saw your post. I think you said Bill Finn was your favorite, yes, of all. Yeah. In many ways, same. But the Jonathan Larson Project, I believe, started at 54 Below as a series of concerts. Yes, that
sort of. Yeah. So the wild story about the origin story of the Jonathan Larson Project is it actually began in its earliest form as a miniature lobby concert at City Center before a production of Tick Tick Boom that they did as Encores Off Center. So when Encores was doing like their off-Broadway series, there was an artist board, first led by Janine Tesori and then by Michael Friedman, the late great Michael Friedman. And I was lucky to be on that artist board. And one of the things that we did was to create these lobby projects, which were essentially like complementary, supplementary material to whatever shows they were doing. And the artist board was, when I think back on it, which I have been doing recently because of the Jonathan Larson Project, it was like Shayna Taub, Sam Pinkleton, Michael R. Jackson, MJ Rodriguez, like so many people that have gone on to such cool things. And so one of the things that I did was a miniature unheard Jonathan Larson concert before a performance of Tick Tick Boom that starred Lin-Manuel Miranda as Jonathan. And that concert led to me being in touch with the Larson family about expanding what I did into a, larger piece, which was, a song cycle that Jonathan Larson might have created, which we did for 12 performances at 54 Below in 2018. But that earliest version, it's so interesting because like it led to all of it in a weird way, even though it really was like, it was the rickety, like makeshift stage in the city center lobby. It was only 5 songs. It was not, most of the people didn't end up doing the Jonathan Larson Project. But like Lin-Manuel was around and he later hired me to work on the Tick Tick Boom movie as the historian consultant because he knew I was working on the Jonathan Larson Project and had this, basis of knowledge of all of the archives. And so really that City Center concert led to both things in a way. And it was so lucky that the Larson family kept saying yes to everything I asked them. And that really came from their confidence in me, which started with that miniature concert.
Were we all crying during that Sunday sequence during Tick Tick Boom?
Oh man, that was so special.
It really was. It really was. Yeah, and I just, I did Tick Tick Boom. Oh God, so long ago. Was much younger than going on 30, but that's okay. It's still also kind of like Bill Finn's work, his material just taps into a different essence of the human experience. But the point I want to make about that concert, that then, and to the book that you've just released, you've written a musical. I mean, as because to your point about conceived by, in film and TV, you often story by, right? I mean, it's the same idea, and that's the core of everything. So, well, I'm
Yeah.
sure obviously you had many collaborators that helped to chisel it over the years. Would does that not feel true that it's a musical that you've created?
It does feel true. It does feel true. It's funny though because it's just such a specific thing to conceive a musical. I was really adamant that we weren't going to change any of the words that Jonathan Larson wrote. We did not change a single word. And so people were really blown away by, there's like a reference to Trump in the show. There's so much that is so resonant. There's a song about fake news. There's a song called White Male World about the patriarchy. There's all these things. Like every single night someone that I didn't know usually would come up to me and be like, you really didn't change a single word. And we really didn't. And that doesn't mean that I didn't create the show. And, so much of the process of creating the show and spending time at the Library of Congress and interviewing his friends and really researching all of his unheard work was figuring out what this show wanted to be and which songs wanted to be in it and how they wanted to be created. A lot of the work was a demo that Jonathan Larson left behind with no sheet music. And it's just him singing with his piano. And of course, we turned that with our amazing music team into like a fully orchestrated and arranged version, sometimes for 5 people, for a full band, for a dramatized version in a show. But we didn't change any words. So it's an interesting thing to be like, I wrote it. I didn't write it, I created it, but it's just a specific thing where, not very many musicals have conceivers. They have to be like a really specific kind of like part of the genre in order to have a conceiver. But I do feel like I was shaping the material very much over the 11 years that I worked on it.
You and Cameron McIntosh. All right. So you graduated NYU, I believe, in 2008, and I'm guessing that you did not talk about Boca Raton. You were New York, Broadway. You were there. So where were you going to go? That's probably why you wanted to go to NYU, right? You were in the heart of it all. So you stayed, right?
Totally. I was just like, I'm going to New York. And it's a cliche, but like New York really was my campus. I feel like I learned so much during college by having the opportunity to like go see shows and see how they changed during previews and just meet people in the industry and learn about how everything worked and where it was in person. And so, after college, I was really, really lucky in that my senior year, I interned with Jeff Bowen and Hunter Bell, who created the musical Title of Show. And this came about because I was just so obsessed with Title of Show. And I created this NYU performance that I invited them to, and they came and we kept in touch. And they let me be their intern while they were creating what I think is like the real first Broadway web series. Like it was like 2007, 2008, early days of the internet. And I would do things like run around getting like props for Cheyenne Jackson or Jonathan Groff and Leah Michelle or whatever. We created this, web series that they did such an incredible job with. It's still so funny. And then when Title of Show actually did end up moving to Broadway, which was what the whole thing was about, Michael Buress, the director, hired me as his assistant. And so I was really lucky in that on the cusp of graduating from NYU, I had this amazing opportunity to like work on a Broadway show that really changed my life and, it inspired me in so many ways. But I did spend like the 2 years after college doing all of the stuff that, it's a rite of passage. And I'm so grateful for it now of like day jobs and babysitting and tutoring and running around getting like a really cool theater job that was only 2 weeks long and volunteering for this. And, it was a smorgasbord of a lot of things and applying for so many jobs I didn't get because really I feel like I so did not fit into a mold. And I thought at that point, what I really want to do is work in a producer's office. And I interviewed to work in producers' offices and they like couldn't figure it out. They were like, but you're doing other things. And those opportunities never quite panned out. And it wasn't until I started creating my own work, like I started creating If It Only Even Runs a Minute, the concert series I did celebrating underappreciated musicals with Kevin Michael Murphy. And I started working with Joe Iconis and producing his concerts. And it wasn't until I started like creating my own stuff that some of the same people who I had interviewed with and not gotten jobs with said like, oh, we want you to come work for us and do what you're doing out there. And so I ended up working for Ken Davenport, who I was in his office working for him for 3 years. He hired me because he saw what I was doing on Joe Iconis's musical Blood Song of Love. And he was like, get that girl in my office to do that on my shows. So definitely like 2 years out of college were the experiences that ended up shaping so much of what I would do later. But again, like it was so much. I passed the high school of performing arts the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, I tutored the SAT there for like an entire year. Like, we all think back on those early day jobs, and I think of them very fondly. But it was definitely like the climb.
Well, a big point I think I might have mentioned. A big part of what we explore in this podcast is about artist sustainability. That's sort of the lens in
Sure.
which we look at art and entrepreneurialism. And um, I started exploring thoughts about what this work could be, which is separate from this as a podcast, about 11 years ago. But I say this because in many ways the hypothesis has come true that, to your point that you just made, it doesn't matter what you do as a theater historian or a producer or an actor or a trumpet player, if we sit around and wait for someone to go, okay, now you can do the thing that you're passionate about, we might be waiting for a very long time.
Totally.
And especially in your case, because you are so unique as a person, as an artist, as a contributor to the theater world, that's so hard, especially early, to say, oh, Jen Tepper, this is what she does. You have to show us, tell us. To your point, I interview with producing offices, but it wasn't quite lining up, except that person, that Ken, who says, I see it. I see the unique quality here. So long way of saying, you kept saying until I started making my own stuff, instead of making my own
Yeah.
opportunities. Does that feel true for you?
Totally, totally. And it's what I tell anyone who asks me as far as like young people starting out or folks looking to get into other fields. Like, I think that in whatever way and whatever like bandwidth or amount of time you have, doing the stuff that you want to be doing. It's like that thing of like, if you want to be a playwright, do a pizza reading for 10 people. And then, the next time it'll be 20 people. But it really is that thing of just doing it because you love it and building on it. And I think sometimes there's this misconception of like, don't work for free, especially among younger people, where it's like, sure, don't, basically get taken advantage of, but creating stuff that you care about on your own time with people you want to be creating with, even if you're not getting paid for it at first, if that is fulfilling to you, like in itself, it's not 100% of the time going to lead to some, full-time paid job opportunity. But in a lot of cases, it does. Like if you make yourself indispensable and you show what you can do, look how many people, it's the Mindy Kaling thing, right? Of like, I never got hired to do things at the highest level until I created my own work and like showed
Exactly.
people what I could do in my own voice. And I think so often with anyone who's an individual, someone unique in the business, you have to show people before they start hiring you to do it.
So maybe along those lines, and related to the other jobs you had, what were some of those early challenges or just lessons that you learned in the early stage of your career that you might even be very grateful for today because you've learned from them?
Yeah. I think just that fear that eats at anyone and at any stage of your career. This is a sidebar, but related. I remember like reading about the original company members of Follies having to audition and being like, oh my God, those legendary actors who were like later in their careers, like having to audition, it never ends. And it's true that like a lot of the time you're proving yourself forever, and you can have
Yeah.
doubt at any stage of your career that like, what if there isn't a next job? Obviously, what if there isn't a next opportunity? And I think like that was really scary in those early years of, even though I was doing stuff that I cared about so much and like just about making rent every month and like, figuring it out, there was this fear of like, oh, I'm maybe never going to get that like full-time job working in theater. That's what I really want. And I kept going because like it was that thing where I didn't have another choice. Like there's nothing else I would want to do other than like being immersed in theater. And I figured out how to make it work, but it definitely was scary. And I think like so much of all of this, like the key to it is finding your tribe and finding your people, which means like your friends, your collaborators, like your people that will understand if you're like having a discouraging day creating or an amazing day creating, and support it either way. That is such a big part of like life in New York. And I also think like nobody loves New York more than me, and I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But there's this thing of like, it is a learning curve. And like, no matter when you move here, I think if you're 18 for college, or if you're, 30 or 40, whatever age you are, even if it's your dream, there are things that are different and difficult about moving anywhere, especially New York, that take time to like figure out and calibrate. And yeah, I think that that's like a big part of the creative life if you're living in a city, is like figuring out how to make the city work for you as well.
Speaking about finding your tribe, and you already brought him up, you have this infamous relationship with Joe Iconis. Infamous might be the wrong word, but you've built this deep collaboration with him. So where did that start, and what is it about his work that you are so taken with?
Yeah. So my first internship that I ever had was at the York Theater. I was an intern, and I really wanted to intern there because they, at the time, this was like 2005, 2006, and they did everything I loved, like, underappreciated musicals and the Mufti series, which like brought, underappreciated shows to life, and then also new musicals. And I was like doing some work in the back office at one point, like cataloging shows that people had submitted, and I found Joe Iconis's demo, and I was like, "What are these songs?" I'm trying to remember if it was a CD. It was not a tape. I think I want to like make up some apocrypha that said it, but it was a CD. But I heard some of his songs. I was like, "Oh my god, who is this writer? Like, this is so much more amazing than anything I've heard all summer." And so it was really that demo tape, which had like Celia Keenan Bolger singing "Blue Hair." It was so long ago. I should look up exactly what was on it. And then I saw one of his concerts, and I was like, "Oh my god, this is like the new musical theater that I like have been like looking for." And so I was a fan before I was ever a friend, and I went to some of his concerts. And then the way we first got connected professionally was that we had a co-producer on Title of Show who was producing a small run of Joe's show, Things to Ruin. And I said to her, like, "Oh my god, let me assist you. I want to like work in producing." And so I was like assistant producer on that run of Things to Ruin at Second Stage, hashtag RIP, because now it's a different space very recently.
Yes.
And so on 43rd Street, we like started collaborating for the first time, and we just found that like our sensibilities, mine and Joe's, but also like mine and everyone that he had gathered at that point into the family of collaborators that he has, that's grown so much since then. That was 2009. We just really, really came together in a way that made sense, and I loved working with those people, and I loved what he was doing. And it's so funny because over the years, as we've experienced a lot of other, talking about Bill Finn, talking about Jonathan Larson, so often, I'm not going to say like Joe and I have the exact same opinion on all musicals and musical theater writers, but a lot of the ways that he's inspired by history are very similar to a lot of the ways that I'm inspired by history. And so I always was just really excited by his work. And over the years, I've occupied a lot of different jobs on a lot of his shows, and the experiences that we had on like Be More Chill and Broadway Bounty Hunter were, which is right behind me on my wall, were fairly unique, because, I won't say that commercial producing was ever my dream, but having this like incredible opportunity to bring one of his shows to Broadway because of a very unique path it had was an exciting and crazy experience that felt like the culmination of like over a decade of work.
Well, this is important for me to talk about because both of the two things about Be More Chill and Broadway Bounty Hunter that I want to talk about. Number one, for you, how do you approach producing projects that challenge commercial norms? Because both of those projects do that. So just starting with that, what's your approach?
Yeah. So what's so interesting about this is like even though I always wanted to work in producing and making musicals happen, I don't necessarily think commercial producing was ever what I wanted to do. And I definitely wasn't opposed to the idea that like that opportunity might arise, and it did. And it's one of those things where I was ready for the opportunity to produce Humor Chill. It happened because of the album going viral. It was like a confluence of events. But it wasn't like my dream is to be a commercial producer. And in fact, like, I haven't since then, and I don't think I will again unless a very specific opportunity presents itself. But for me, like it's sort of at odds, right? Because you and I have always bonded over like enjoying musicals that might not have run for the longest period of time, and that not being a one-to-one with quality. And so there's something at odds to me about commercial producing, because I know for a fact that like it isn't based on quality, it's based on circumstances and reviews and this demographic and this element of ticket buying. And so I think that the opportunity that happened was that the Be More Chill album went viral, and it went viral very like authentically. The experience that we had was like Joe did the musical in 2015 at Two River Theater in New Jersey, and when the show got a bad New York Times review, every theater and producer that was coming canceled their tickets. Like it literally was like the morning after opening night, like never mind, good luck next time, kid. And the show got a cast recording, even though it only ran for 1 month in New Jersey, with audiences who really liked it, but like certainly was not a success because of the review. It only got a cast recording because these amazing donors at the theater, the Recknitzes, were like, we love this show and we're going to give you the, $100,000 to do the cast recording. And so that was 2015. And then the cast recording came out and 15 people listened to it and we loved it and we were proud of it. And I wasn't even working on it in any official capacity. And so when the show went viral from the cast recording, all of a sudden there were people interested in doing it. We were able to get a theater. There were investors interested. And I had spent a number of years getting experience working for producers and on shows, so that by the time this happened, I was like, okay, like if the way to make this musical happen is me raising the money and me being the producer, like I can do it, like let's do it. But it wasn't like I said, I'm going to produce Be More Chill and then it happened. It really was because of the set of circumstances, which it's really interesting. I've thought about it recently in comparison to like if Songs for a New World had come out in the era of like Pandora and Apple Music and Spotify and YouTube algorithms, like we would have been here with Songs for a New World. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes,
because that album did go viral in its own 1990s, early 2000s way. But it was really like that combination of how the internet kind of made it. The internet didn't make the album go viral, but the platforms that were there at the time that the album started catching on were really like a wild kind of unique ride. And so I was so proud to produce it. Like I was so proud to work with all of those people and to bring that musical to life. But it's funny because Joe's written so many musicals and it could just as soon have been one of the other ones. It wasn't like, okay, Be More Chill is the best musical Joe's ever written. It was just like, okay, this is the show that has caught on. We have this opportunity. Like, let's go, let's do it.
Well, I often I refer to it as the Be More Chill effect. And when I'm talking with writers, people who might not have many ins to the community, or might have a good show, or just trying to figure out how do I get this thing produced. Yes, of course, there's the path of the Ken Davenports picking it up and saying, I want to do this. But there are, as you know, thousands of musical theater writers who are untapped and unproduced. And for me, as an outsider looking in, one of the ways that you have changed the landscape, even if you might not have been the one pushing the virality of the project, is by setting an example for what I think is the power of the modern world. So high concept. I didn't mean all that. What I simply mean is the show garnered an audience, which is low-key part of what it means to be alive in 2025. Who's your audience, and subsequent relevancy, and took this, not that Joe Iconis was unknown, but you know what I'm saying. These unknown, all these unknown components, even the cast, George, etc., and put it in a big commercial light. And to me, that is so incredibly empowering, because when you go, well, I got the show, and yes, I'm doing the typical stuff, trying to introduce it and sending it to the York and getting people, whatever. I also could be sharing it and doing what, a 15-year-old in Bangladesh who's worth $2.4 million right now is doing, because they simply have access to a phone that can say, here are my thoughts. Does that feel true to you? And
Totally.
what did you learn about the power of online and what that could mean for modern audiences?
Totally. It's tricky because I think there's this thing that in marketing agencies on Broadway, they laugh about, because producers will be like, yeah, like, let's make this video and get it to go viral. And it's like, you can't get something to go
Yeah.
viral. Like,
Yes.
it's just, it's something that happens. And it was so funny because it really did just happen. It was the algorithms. It was people loving Be More Chill. It was like it catching on naturally through fans. And so it really did happen. There was nothing we could have done to make it happen. It just did happen. But it was that thing of like being ready when the opportunity comes. And so I think
Michael in the bathroom, right? Specifically. Was that
exactly.
my partner still sings that song? His name's Michael. He still sings Michael in the bathroom all the time. Anyway, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
I guess it's relatable if your name is Michael.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
But no, it was the there was a video of the Michael in the bathroom being recorded that went viral alongside the album going viral on the streaming services. And the thing is, though, it's still like you're still dependent on the machinations of the industry, right? So we had this like completely sold out commercial off Broadway run, which is like all but unheard of.
At Signature?
And it was because of the power of like people having heard that album and wanting to see the show live. And it was because of that sold out commercial off Broadway run that we got a Broadway theater. I feel like I'm often explaining this as a theater historian. Like I did a talk about my book recently at a retirement home, and they wanted to talk about Broadway real estate. And I was explaining how, in the most simplistic of terms, like you are at the mercy of the landlords who have to give you a theater. And so like, if I had been that, you know, what did you say? Like the 15-year-old in Bangladesh with millions of dollars, I still might have not been able to get a Schubert venue for Be More Chill. It's you have to have the money, you have to have the show, but you also have to have the landlords on your side. And in this current theater environment, when like a theater opens up and there's 6 producers that all have shows ready, the landlord is obviously picking, you know, we live in capitalism. They're picking the show that they think will be the most successful. And so the fact that we got a Broadway theater was based on not just the album going viral, not just being able to raise the millions of dollars to do the show, which Jerry Gehring, who was the lead producer, he was the reason we were able to do all of that in the first place. But it was the fact that the show had sold out off Broadway. Like you need all of these things in order for that to happen. And then, you know, I'm so proud of the show, and it makes me not even slightly less proud of it if we had run for a million years, if we had run for less than the time we ran. Like yes. That has nothing to do with it. But I will say that like, I don't think that it's possible to have a show that like gets the steam behind it from all of those things and then runs on Broadway with like no star, no major brand name, without, you know, the critical approval that we didn't get, and without the award season stuff we didn't get. You're kind of dependent on all of these different factors to like get high enough in order to run. And so we were so proud of the show, but the fact that like people still did kind of look down on it from a critical perspective, and that was part of why we didn't like, you know, run. You know, that's also like, as a producer, there's nothing you can do to control that. There's nothing you can do to change that. And so I think part of the thing for me is like producing is making the show happen, right? But in a lot of ways, like the industry considers like producers, it's like success or failure is based on whether the show runs. But so many of the reasons that are why the show runs or not are completely out of producers' hands. So in that way, I knew all of that going into it, but experiencing it firsthand was its own like, you know, kind of set of lessons, right? Because you sit there and you're like, I can work as hard as I can work, and I can do everything that I can to make this show a success. But at the end of the day, you are at the mercy of critics, award season, ticket buying public, what shows are coming out at the same time, you know, just like public sentiment, like all of these things that you can do the same show in 2 different seasons and have 2 different results and have no idea, you know, it's always a guessing game. So it's why there's no perfect, you know, method for producing. It's like theater is always alchemy. So it was an interesting learning experience in all of those ways. And it was also like so specific. When people are like, how do you make the internet do that? I'm like, we didn't make it do that and no one can. It's like, it's the power of the people. Like it really was very like democratic that it went viral the way it did.
I attended, do you mind that I call you Jen, by the way? Do you prefer Jennifer?
You can call me Jen. Yeah. I go by like Jennifer Ashley Tepper when it's a full name thing, but Jen is also great.
Jennifer, well, great. Okay, both. But I was at Jennifer Ashley Tepper's event at the New York Public Library the other day. And we're going to talk about women writing musicals in just a little bit. But one of the stories I'm not sure if it's in the book, which is why I'm asking you this, was the story, because I think you even put it up there, of David Merrick famously... well, you tell the story, because I'm not sure if it's in the book or not, but tell, because I think this is great.
It is in the book. It's such a great story that I love so much. But David Merrick thought of this, the infamous, and he was
He is
infamous.
infamous.
Notorious.
Yes.
Yes, Broadway producer David Merrick, very successful and very, eccentric Broadway producer, but he came up with this idea in the 60s, for the next time that he had a show that wasn't a big hit, that he didn't think would be a big hit, to wine and dine all of these regular people, citizens from the phone book that had the same names as the prevailing critics at the time, and then to take out an ad with those critics' names saying like, I loved it, best musical ever, even though it was just a random man who had just gotten like a steak dinner from David Merrick and then seen a show for free. And so for Subways Are for Sleeping, which was that show, he did this and he pulled it off, and it was in the newspaper with like 7 out of 7 agree, and all these men who had the same names as the critics raving about the show that was not, a hit show from the regular critics. So it was like a great stunt that people point to as like a really, I think this all the time, especially with Smash on Broadway, when people were like, Smash the TV show is so outlandish and this could never happen, that can never happen. And like every day something crazier happens on Broadway. So I sometimes am like, Smash was a documentary, but if there was an episode of Smash where someone pulled that David Merrick stunt, they'd all be like, this could never happen, if they didn't know that he actually did that. But yeah, I did that. I put that up on the screen to talk about Comden and Green, and of course the great Betty Comden, one of our amazing female musical theater writers in history.
Yes. Well, okay, so you've been the creative programming director at 54 Below, the iconic 54 Below, for what, 12 years?
So long, 12 years.
Is it 12
I guess
years?
with the COVID gap, but yeah, like 12 years since 2013.
And you have helped what? 10,000 performances at this point, something like that.
I update the number all the time, but it's essentially it's about 700 per year, but then there's the COVID gap. So it's really like thousands and thousands of performances. It's definitely over 8,000 at this point.
So how okay, I guess my 2 questions is, as long as I remember, as long as, because we were the same age, so same obsession, same time. Yours a bit more focused, mine a bit more manic and emotional. But I always remember 54 Below being the iconic venue that it's represented, and even before I came to New York, and I've had an opportunity to perform there a couple of times. How do you even was it that for you before you even stepped in? Did you create that? But then also, how do you even begin to curate something at that scale when you have to be doing, I'm guessing, upwards of 3-4 shows a day sometimes? Am I making that up?
It's a large volume of shows. Yeah. So the wild thing is very similar to my journey with Ken Davenport, where he saw what I was doing on Joe Iconis's musical and was like, I want to hire her to do that on my shows. It was really producing the Joe Iconis Christmas extravaganza that got me my job at 54 Below, because for the first couple years we did this show at Ars Nova that is Joe's, zany version of like a Christmas special, with all of our collaborators playing Christmas characters and original songs and Christmas stories and all of that. And we did it at Ars Nova. And during the first year that 54 Below had opened in 2012, Ars Nova happened to be booked. And so we were like, oh, maybe we could do it at that fancy new venue on 54th Street. And so I produced the show at 54 Below. And then this was shortly after they opened. And the original programming director, Phil Bond, he wanted to do something else. And so he was talking about bringing on me as programming director to replace him. And the owners of the venue, who are now the founders, they knew me from producing Joe's show. And so they did want to talk to me because they already knew me from that. So Phil originally programmed the Laurie Beachman, which was where I produced some of my first concerts, like If It Only Runs a Minute. And so it all kind of came full circle. And when I started talking to them about being the creative and programming director, it just felt like the perfect fit. And it was a way to incorporate theater history and new writers and, emerging performers and all of these things that I love. And it has elements of producing and it has elements of history. So it really is interesting, because the job that I've had for so long at 54 Below is something that didn't exist when I was in college. But if I could have invented it, I would have, because it does bring together like so many of these things that I love. And at the same time, one of the things that I've loved so much about it is that while it is like a really demanding job that has a lot of facets, I've been able to do other projects at the same time. Like I've been able to write books and have the flexibility to go produce a show or conceive a show. And so it's been like such such an amazing place to work for so many years. I'm so proud of the fact that like it's been so many years of programming that I can say, hey, like we programmed this musical and now it went on to like great life on and off Broadway, or like, you know, this performer or this writer had early opportunities at 54 Below and has gone on to do all of these things. So it's been long enough for that to be the case. And then also it's like my favorite thing that I still get to program and work with artists who like, you know, we grew up worshiping on cast albums and who come and recreate performances that I loved from like Broadway history. So it's really the best of all possible worlds in a lot of ways for me.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure you do love it, but I'm sure it's also, you know, and at this point, you know, something that you can do quite well and understand enough that gives you, as you're saying, enough. It's a job, it pays your bills, while also giving you the flexibility to do the other things
Totally.
you want to do. Like what a great day job in a lot of
Totally.
ways.
Totally. It is true though that and it's interesting, it's just like working on Broadway changes, right? Where like even though there are so many parts of it that I feel like are a well-oiled machine, including like our amazing staff and the way that a lot of our systems work, you know, we all know it's harder to sell tickets in a lot of ways now than it was before COVID. What are the new challenges? There are literally always new challenges. There's always also it's like it's never the same show twice. It's never the same group of artists twice, you know, and it's something that I love about it. It's, you know, as opposed to working on the same show 8 times a week, you're always working a little bit with a lot of different people. And sometimes it's the case where like something doesn't require a lot of my attention. And so like, I don't even pay, you know, any attention to it. And then another show can require a lot of attention. It really changes from day to day. It's not a thing where it's the same every day. And so that keeps me on my toes, but it also makes it so that it's not really on, you know, on what is the word I'm looking for? Like it's not an autopilot.
So, well, I could imagine. So then what kind of shows or artists are you drawn to programming, and how do you balance that with, you know, essentially audience taste with creative
Totally.
risk? Because obviously, like you're saying, you're having to reinvent the wheel and sell a new show, and you got to sell the show because you got to pay everybody. So anyway, what's that
The
balance?
joy of having like a 146 seat venue is that, and I'm being so specific, I usually say 150 seats, but this is like for creative. So we're going to be real.
Yeah.
But the joy of that is like, you know, I don't have to only book things that have an odd, like, it's not like if this can't sell 8 times a week to Broadway demographics, it's such a wonderful thing to be like, yeah, we have this amount of seats and we can book your show 6 months in advance. So you have all this time to plan. And it allows us to give opportunities to a lot of people that we might not be able to if we had a different kind of venue, which I love. But it's tricky because, well, one of the things that's funny that relates to what you asked about is when I first started out, it was, of course, 12 years ago. So the new writers who I was booking 12 years ago were very different than the new writers I'm booking now. And a lot of the time, I love keeping up with like what's going on with like emerging artists now, but it's such a different generation and it's not the same age of people and it's not the same age as me. And a lot of times, you know, I love their work just as much as I love the work of people that were coming up 12 years ago, but it's different. And people have different ticket buying patterns and it's different methods of promotion. And the fact that we were so reliant on traditional media and traditional journalism to sell concerts and cabarets when I first started out. And now it's all social media and it's all about that. And it's not to say that I wouldn't book an artist if they didn't have like, you know, a TikTok or something like that. But you do have to very seriously look at social media as one of the methods that artists promote themselves. I was talking to like a very talented musical theater writer the other day who I think is like so great and who started to win some awards. And he was telling me that like, and I so understand this on an emotional level, but he was like, because of everything going on in the world, he was like, I'm going to delete all my social media. Like, I just can't take it anymore. And I was like, I completely understand, but like, may I just discuss this with you? Because like, as a writer who has to promote their own work, I totally understand like taking breaks from the news, doing things for your mental health, but you have to make an informed decision about it because when someone's going, oh, I love that writer, I saw their concert, I wonder what they're doing next, they're going to your Instagram. Like that's just the way that the world works. And so often in you know, marketing for shows that are at 54 Below or the Jonathan Larson Project, I'm like, God, I wish there was a platform or a way that people were looking at something where you didn't have to look at something going on in the world right next to like, oh, I'm doing this concert tomorrow. But because that's the world we live in, like, how are you going to make it serve you? And is what you really want to eliminate yourself from all all these ways that people find you as an artist. I think it's like a pretty unique challenge that people aren't talking about a lot, that we all have to kind of keep existing on these platforms that also can have problems with mental health struggles because of what's going on in the world. And so it's just interesting. And I think that as I book 54 Below shows and I review who the artist is, and I look at their work, and I look at what other stuff they've done in the recent past, but you're looking at how they do promote themselves. That's a part of it for sure. And so it's always changing, like how the ways that we promote ourselves kind of evolve constantly.
Well, as I think about it, I've actually done a number of things at 54 Below, and you've always been very kind and helpful when I've been like, oh, can we do this? Can we do that? But it's funny because I remember, I'll never forget. You probably don't remember this, but there was I was doing this thing that I used to do in DC called the No Rules Show, I think is what.
Yeah,
and I think And I remember we had this one night, and we did it a couple times, and it was fine. It was fine. We were finding our footing, but one night, it was just we didn't sell it well. And Orphe was producing, and she was not pleased to be performing to a small crowd. But I remember finishing that and going, it's not just about, it's for all involved, that the consideration of how can I sell the show? It sounds great. I want 4 nights. Sounds wonderful. And then when push comes to shove, both for the audience, for the performers, for the venue, because the numbers have to be made up somewhere, and it's complicated. And you probably have to do the weird dance of being like encouraging and helpful and inspiring, and also being like, look, is this realistic? Is that true?
It's hard, especially because in the world that we live in, there are times when like the person you've never heard of, obviously I'm using that in a reductive way, but it's like the person you've never heard of sells out the venue, and the person that we all love, who we know really well as a Broadway performer, doesn't sell out the venue. And a lot of times it has to do with like how you're reaching your audience. And
Right.
Like, of course, 54 Below is marketing alongside you the whole time, but it's a unique dance. And it also is like, as a commercial venue, which we were for many years, and as a nonprofit venue, the way that we operate is we have to hit a certain amount of tickets sold. We have to hit a certain amount of shows per week. We have to do all these things in order to stay open. So constantly doing the dance between reality and quality of art. And also the fact that like, I've always felt like there aren't good and bad musicals. There's just musicals you love and musicals someone else loves. And the same thing goes for programming, right? Like, it's like, I can program this artist who I think will do well for these reasons, and I love this artist, and I can program this artist who's like not my taste, but who I think is quality and will do well for these reasons. It's not like I love every show running on Broadway equally, and like, that's fine. It's not always going to be like my show. I thought about this a number of years ago because I've since grown to love a lot of things about it, but I remember when I was at the musical Shrek, and I was like, okay, like I love a lot of the people involved, but this isn't my favorite musical on earth. And then there was this one song where I was like leaning forward, and I was like, wait, this is my favorite song. This is amazing. And it's like Brian Darcy James singing this ballad. And it was the only time that the audience was like, like crinkling their bags and coughing. And like, I was like, okay, like this is my Shrek. This is that guy's Shrek. It's art is subjective. And that's like the beautiful thing about it. And so it's actually something I really love, that I can go like, oh, here's a 54 Below show that I think this demographic of people, or this artist, or, this person will thrive and this audience will enjoy. And it's not always like, 700 shows a year that are my favorite 700 shows. It's just what I think will function well as a venue for everybody. So it's like a unique animal. It's an ecosystem.
Well, look, I mean, I think Joe Iconis, Jonathan Larson, and Bill Finn speak volumes about your tastes in musicals. And again, I'm with you. So, okay, I, as you can tell, I can nerd out with you all day long, and I have so many questions. So I'm going to go fast, and I'm being mindful of time, Jen. But before women writing musicals, which we're going to talk about, your first books were the Untold Stories of Broadway, which were your first books, multiple, yes, volume. So what inspired you to start collecting those oral histories that then became those books?
Yeah. So the Untold Stories of Broadway, there are 4 volumes, and there will eventually be 6 volumes, because basically each book takes you through a number of the Broadway theaters through people's personal stories who I've interviewed, and I have to get to all the theaters. So I really was inspired when I first started spending time in Broadway theaters, and specifically spending time at the Lyceum with Title of Show, which I then got to return to for Be More Chill. It was so exciting to go like, oh, what other musicals were here, and like who was in these dressing rooms, and who was in this orchestra pit. And so the physical history of the theaters became so fascinating to me, more so than ever during that. And then I thought, someday I'm going to write a book, and it's going to be like sort of like at this theater, but not, where it's, people's personal stories of the theaters going year by year. And I met 2 amazing women, Brisa Trincaro and Roberta Pereira, who's now the executive director of the New York Public Library and of Performing Arts. And the two of them were like, we're starting this publishing company. Would you want to pitch us a book? And so again, it was that thing where like I had the idea, I was ready to write it. I met these 2 women, and we just started doing this without fully knowing what we were doing. When I pitched them the book, we really thought it would be 1 volume, and we always laugh about that, because like I had all these outlines and all these plans, and then I started working on it, and with the editor, I was like, this is not 1 volume. Even the 4th volume, which came out during COVID, I'm like, this is way too long. This could have been 2 books. But it was so exciting to start interviewing people. And when I did the first book, I did like, right now there's like 300 interviews that comprise the series that have been divided up by theater. But for the first book, I did like the first 200 interviews basically within like 7 months. And it was the most thrilling time. It was 2013. And I had all of these days where it would be like, okay, at 10 a.m., I'm interviewing Danny Burstein on a bench in the park. And at 12 p.m., I'm interviewing like this costume designer in their costume studio. And then I'm going in the Heights to interview Lin-Manuel at a coffee shop at 2 p.m. And I would have like 6 interviews.
Literally in the
each day. It's
Heights.
like, yeah, I did interview him in the Heights. I always have to say. Like, I went like backstage at people's dressing rooms. Like, some of the interviews were on the phone, and I literally remember like interviewing Jonathan Groff while he was riding a bike down the street. Like, it was so interesting to interview people where they were at, both like physically and also like where they were at in that moment. Like talking to people in 2013, it's like a time capsule. And I interviewed so many people whose I have still their words that haven't been published yet, who are no longer with us, who it ended up being this legacy project that I couldn't have even conceived at the time, that captured like a moment. And so my goal was always to start each chapter as far back in time as possible, and getting folks who were there in the 1940s to talk about musicals they did in the 1940s and have that start a chapter that leads us all the way up to today. Like, it was so thrilling to capture that history. And I really think all the time that sort of fed my programming of 54 Below, and vice versa, where I don't know if Patti LuPone would have let me interview her for my book if I hadn't programmed her at 54 Below. And I don't know if I would have been able to get such a huge slate of artists at 54 Below from the beginning if I didn't have all these contacts I'd made myself through theater historian and author work. So it was very much something that they fed each other.
But I want to talk a little bit more about the research process, because it's not something that I really understand. I mean, I do quote unquote research, but you do research, especially when you're working on something so sprawling and detailed for all your work. And I'm saying this, that there's an art to it. I'm just assuming that there's an art to it. I would love to hear a little bit more about what your process and what you love, and also what drives you mad.
That's a great question. What was interesting, and I thought about it a lot during Women Writing Musicals, was because I researched that book during deep COVID, like during the pandemic, I really did it in like throughout 2020, where we weren't leaving our apartments. And so having those limitations as an artist was actually really thrilling. Like, it's that thing, I think, where, you're told like you have an hour to create this song. And so you're like, okay, like,
Yes.
knowing you have that, and knowing that I had my library of books, and then I had the internet for Women Writing Musicals, but I didn't have like the library or resources that I normally have to like go places, was interesting. And it made me dive into newspaper archives that I might have not used otherwise. Women Writing Musicals, because it was about, female musical theater writers that are left out of history books, I ended up, finding so many pieces of history in newspapers that were, again, like not the New York Times, not Variety, not Backstage, but like lesser known local papers and papers that were defunct, because I like dug into those newspaper archives on the internet because I was in my apartment during COVID. And so it was interesting to see how the limitations led to creativity and led to research that I might have not found otherwise. And I think it's different for each project. Like the Jonathan Larson Project is research based. And when I started researching that at the Library of Congress, I realized that I didn't think I could put together a song cycle of Jonathan Larson's unheard work until I listened to every single tape and read every single paper and went through everything. And there was such a huge amount of material, and it was in Washington, D.C. physically. And so the reason like that show took years to develop in between, the earliest concert and off Broadway, it's like it was so much research to just make sure that we were creating the version of the show that took into account all of the work. And so I love research. Like I'm so inspired by it. And even thinking about like I know like we all struggled in our own unique ways during the pandemic, but the fact that like when I think back on that time writing women writing musicals, and I think about like putting a Gretchen Cryer and Nancy Ford album on my record player and like opening up some like books about women in the 1920s, and like I was like heartened, and like I was kept going by writing that book. And it really was so inspiring to think about women who overcame great adversity and who were writing shows during other difficult times in history and all of that during a time when, the world was going through something so difficult universally. So I find research constantly inspiring. One of the things that's the most frustrating, and it's like one of the things I try to combat all the time, is people just not taking the initiative to learn, and people thinking that like, the world was created yesterday. And so often with challenges that people run into either creatively or like, related to the running of Broadway or, current shows, I think like, oh, if only people understood and took the time to like learn about the past and not just click on the thing that's shown to them first, but like read a book or research or look up your own, information. I think people would be like happier, more educated, more interested, more engaged, just like all of these good things from just understanding the people that came before us and struggles that they went through and challenges and, good things. So it's something where every time I'm standing in front of an audience talking about history and I see people kind of freak out and go, I didn't know that happened. And I was like, well, like take the initiative and like take the time to look it up. And if you're going like, why haven't I heard of any of these women? Like look up current female musical theater writers and go see their work. It's that thing where it's like, there's not just one good show in New York that you should go see. There's so many things, and you have to look for what interests you by being proactive. And I think that's the same with research. Like looking into things and being proactive is the key to everything.
Well, I came home from that event the other day, and I said to my partner, I said, did you know over 300 women have helped to create Broadway musicals? And I said, and you might have said this, or I might have said it, but I was like, I could probably think of like 30, and I'm a pretty well-read, quote unquote, person. I'm pretty much, but there was so much that even in that presentation you offered up. So I guess, what was the moment you realized that this book needed to exist?
I got really excited by the idea of it not just being about the Betty Comdens and the Dorothy Fields and the Janine Tessoris, who of course are like centerpieces of the book and who I love, but it also being about all of these women who wrote one Broadway musical or, led fascinating lives in mostly other fields, or who, we just have completely forgotten about, even though they did have long careers in Broadway and off Broadway. And so I just got very excited by the volume of women and what that tells us about theater history as a whole. It was so fun to go like decade by decade, because you're going, oh, the sound of musicals in the 70s, and here's how that was reflected in what women were doing, or like, what Broadway was like during the golden age and how that's reflected in what women are writing. It was like doing a, parallel history to Broadway history overall. And at the same time, it was so fun to learn more about people who, like I only knew, a little bit about Marta Kaufman, and really thinking about the way that like Friends, which like is obviously an iconic TV show and zeitgeist maker and one of my favorite TV shows, but the way that like that wouldn't have happened without her history as a musical theater writer, thinking about the ways that musical theater has impacted other art forms, thinking about just like early New York history. Like I got very obsessed with that early chapter of like when New York City first started having theater at all that was, you know, memorialized like in the 1700s and 1800s, like what were women doing? And there were women creating entertainments that had songs in them during the time that New York City was settled. Like it almost felt crazy that I couldn't find a lot of research on it because it was so fascinating. And at the same time, it made sense because it's just something that people have not really thought about as a topic unto itself before. So my dream is really that like there'll be more research by the time I do an updated volume, and we'll have more information on some of those early women as well.
Well, and I mean, maybe this is an obvious question, but I'm curious. Why do you think these contributions have historically been left out of the narrative?
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I want to be realistic about is like, you know, obviously there are so many musical theater writers. And when we go like, oh, there's 300 women that are writing musicals, I never did the count, but I imagine like there's tens of thousands of men that have written musicals during that time. You know, there's seasons on Broadway where there were 100 musical theater writers. There's reviews at the time that had so many people contributing. So there are so many musical theater writers. And obviously even the most like, you know, educated of theater historians don't know all of them. There's so many. And think about the thing that I was really struck being left out of history books were when I got to people like Mickey Grant, who was the first woman to write book and music and lyrics for a Broadway musical, and
Yeah.
she starred in it, and it ran for over 1,000 performances, and she was a Black woman who
Yes.
who broke all of these, you know, barriers to
Mother
have
Earth,
all of
what was
these
it?
types of success. And like Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope is not a musical that we learned about, and she's not a person that I think is really taught. And even though we've only recently woken up to the fact that like we need to think about who was making contributions, you know, who came from underrepresented communities in the way that we should have been doing all along, the fact is this was like a very important and successful musical in the 70s, and it's just like it's not taught about. And so I think that part of it that became really fascinating to me, when I say people left out of the history books, I don't just mean like literal history books. I mean like who's not being taught in musical theater classes at universities, which shows are not being produced because they're not licensed. And in the case of Mickey Grant, I became fascinated by the fact that like Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope was on LP and never got transferred to like other forms of media. And so thinking about when I looked at, again, like just as a microcosm of theater, women writing musicals, and it was like, oh, this show sort of disappeared, quote unquote, because it never went from cassette to CD, or it never went from CD to streaming. And a whole generation never heard it because of that. And then they didn't do it at their schools. They didn't sing it for their showcase. You know, it's like the way that these things have a trickle effect that sounds like minutia, but it can really contribute to whether art gets remembered. And so, so much of it has to do with like these tiny decisions being made that are actually huge. And there were people like Anne Caldwell, who I talked about at the library, who like, you know, wrote over 30 Broadway musicals, and we don't really remember her very much. And some of it has to do with the way that, you know, estates that gather power because they have this like big name to, you know, create future productions of, you know, the Irving Berlin estate, the Gershwin estate, the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate. And it's the people that are like, you know, the legacy bearers who take charge. And so it really depends on like when you're gone, who is promoting that, who is getting more work for your shows. In a lot of those cases, it's just like what's happening to your work after you're gone. And it's really circumstantial. But I think like also even just having these women's names in a book, I'm very proud of, but I really hope that like it encourages people to look into, hey, I've never heard of that show or that person, or like, oh, like talk about Marta Kaufman. Like, I want to do personals. Like, that sounds really fun. I would love for people to discover musicals that they haven't heard of in the book and then do them or learn songs from them.
Well, to your point about the estates, you know, I remember I saw the last performance of Amor years ago, and I loved the show so much. And I tried to produce it. I ran a theater for many years, and I tried to produce it. I cannot tell you how complicated, because of the translation and this and that. And it was so complicated, and it's one of those, in my opinion. I mean, I love Michel Legrand, and just in general as a composer, and it's one of those scores that shows that I think is just stunning. And I know they did. Derek, I remember, did some online version. Were you involved? Were you involved with that too?
I saw it. Yeah.
Okay.
I saw it.
So I know like it's and Goodspeed had a moment with it. Like I know there's like it pops up, but the bigger point I'm trying to make is, to your point, that sometimes because we are in a bit of a niche community, musical
Of
theater.
course.
And so if one thread falls loose, something could be MIA
Totally.
forever.
Forever. And it's like, did the score not get, cataloged? Like it's all of these elements that lead to something living on. It's so interesting because when we do musicals in concert at 54 Below that are licensed, it's a whole process that's like a big effort for me and for my team of, we're not doing the grand rites. We're obviously not doing the musical. We're doing like a celebration of it through concert. But we still have to get permission. And most of the time we don't know why, but we really only get approval for like, I would say 40% of the titles that we seek permission for. And the other 60%, we don't know if it's, a show that a producer has optioned for production in New York that precludes that title from having any New York presentation, which I assume, that's what it is some of the time. But like, a number of years ago, we've had like an incredible Broadway, group of people wanting to do a concert of Sweeney Todd, and of course got turned down because like the revival is in the works. And it all makes sense when it comes to like the way that these things are governed. But at the same time, like I can't tell you how often I'm frustrated because I'm like, no, but like we have a reunion that involves like, original cast members and people over the age of 80 telling stories, and we can't do it because there's some contractual reason. But a lot of the time, you're playing a game of telephone and it's like, 40 people across, and you don't know why something might not get approved. And it's similar to like the thing of licensing for Amour or for any musical where, there are so many shows that I think aren't getting licensed as much as they would be because they don't have a cast album, but they don't have a cast album because after they did a production, they were hoping to do another production that didn't materialize. Like, I always think of the show Happiness at Lincoln Center, which was like a personal favorite by Corey and Frankel, who wrote,
Yes.
Great Gardens, and who've had all these other, successful licensed shows. And I think that there's lost musicals because they didn't get a cast recording, because they didn't leap from media form to media form, because there's some snafu that really impacts the legacy of the work. And, I say this with like so much respect for people who are handling all of those things. Most of the time we don't know the inner workings of it, and they're trying to protect the property. Like they're trying to make sure that the best possible thing happens for it. And maybe like this show is not going to get a production if a concert happens because of this negotiation with the producer. And you just kind of have to do your best and just trust that like the right things are going to happen when people push it forward.
Okay, one last question about women's writing musicals. For you, and it could have been Mickey Grant, what was one of the most exciting or surprising or even heartbreaking stories that you discovered when you were writing the book?
Yeah. One of the things that I think was heartbreaking to realize was that even for me, who was like trying to elevate these stories of all of these women, what I was writing about was really like not women writing musicals, but women who wrote musicals that got produced. And so thinking about like in all of these eras, there were so many women writing musicals that wouldn't be in the book because they didn't have their shows done. That was like sobering for me, especially thinking about like all of the women I know writing musicals who like might have gotten one show or might have not gotten a show produced yet, but they're still creators. Like it's almost like sad to think about, but I could only write about people who had that history that I could draw upon, because in most cases I had never met these women. Most of them had passed away before I was in New York. Like writing about past decades, you're reliant on the reviews, and of course, like, who knows how accurate that is. So in every possible case, I tried to write about these women in their own words. Like I tried to draw on interviews that they did where they spoke. But it was sobering to think about like the way that history is just written by the people that then have the last word in that way. As far as like individual stories, I think like some of what was hard to write about was these women who were writing at a time where like women were so objectified. I included a number of like problematic reviews and pieces of journalism, but like it was kind of shocking. There were times where people would assume like someone's husband wrote something for them, or like their appearance would be commented on in a review of their writing. There was all kinds of misogyny and things like that I thought it was really important to include. And sometimes it was heartbreaking, and honestly, sometimes I was like, how amazing that people were like creating at a time where they had to like overcome these things. So it kind of went both ways in that way. I did think about the women who were creating at a time before like Broadway even existed, and the fact that they just thought they were creating like an entertainment for a season, and then it was gone. Like just the ephemeral nature of theater would sometimes make me really inspired and sometimes make me sad.
Well, going back to your point though about the undiscovered women of musical theater, you don't know this, but I'm not even sure if you remember this, but years ago, truly years ago now, we did that concert at 54 of the Tennessee Williams musical.
Yeah.
And this woman is 78 and still working on it. And 54 Below has been the only place where it's had the most fullest, well, Arena Stage had a workshop, but this has been its fullest version in some ways. And she's still working on it 15 years in. And my goal is just to help her get a production up, because to your point, sometimes that production, to River Wherever, is the only way to ultimately memorialize something. Otherwise, here's a completely unknown woman, nearly
Totally.
80, who someone might not even know about, and she spent 15 years dedicating her life to this musical.
Totally. And for me, it really does ring true. And it's rung true recently. Like I was not, I keep waiting for it, but I wasn't really sad when the Jonathan Larson Project closed. I remained so happy that it happened. And like
Yeah.
the miracle of having a commercial off-Broadway musical and like having that show reach the pinnacle of like what I felt like it did and have so many people love it. Like I never got sad. Like I feel like I'm so grateful for just like the fact that these shows can exist, and having like even just a presentation, like that's amazing. Like having people see your work, period. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, it does matter in some ways, but the fact that like the work is out there is at like the core of it. Years ago I produced this show at 54 Below that was Rachel Lily Rosenblum and Don't You Ever Forget It, which is one of the
Yes.
7 Broadway musicals that historically
Yes.
closed during previews, and it had not been done since 73 when it closed after, you know, a week of previews. And we were able to put it back together thanks to the nephew of the writer. And so it's on YouTube, you know, it exists on YouTube. And sometimes like I'll go look at it and it's like the great Bonnie Milligan, who has gone on to such amazing things as Rachel Lee Rosenblum. And I'm going like, oh, like I don't know who these like thousands of views are from, but if like thousands of people heard this that wouldn't have otherwise. And
Yeah.
it's not even just that that's enough for me. Like that's amazing for me. Like all I want is for work to be heard that might have not been heard otherwise. And sometimes it's not going to become Cats, and like that's okay. I'm so excited anytime a
More
new
than
musical
okay.
has a presentation at 54 Below, like a new writer, a new musical, anything, because people that are it's reaching, like it's creating something that didn't exist before.
Exactly. So, okay, so much to that point, where do you see theater? How do you see theater, especially musical theater, evolving over the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think that one thing that gives me so much like heart is that I think that the more that we all get into our technology, the more people crave live performance and the more people like want to be in a room together. And I do think that even younger generations understand that, like, especially after the experience of like the universal isolation of COVID, the idea of like being with humans, it's never going to go away completely. And I feel really great about that. I think that, you know, like everything in the world that we live in, it being so tied to, you know, capitalism and what goes on in the world is scary to a lot of us because, you know, costs going up and things being less accessible. But my hope is just that, like, people continue to create no matter what. And it's something that's inspiring to me about theater history, because when I think about other times, again, that like theater and like people in America went through great adversity and kept creating. I literally was rereading an interview I did recently with someone who was drafted during World War II and like left his Broadway show and then like came back. And, you know, just thinking about other things that people have lived through and kept creating makes me feel like that's like we're going to keep creating no matter what, and art is going to keep being what art is no matter what, and there's going to be different challenges all the time, but it's never going to go away completely. So I feel good about that. The commercial Broadway of it all is tricky because I sometimes have to step back and go, okay, we can all complain about, you know, the things that happen that we don't like as far as like there should always be more original musicals. You know, we always are like, why are these shows getting an opportunity and not these shows? But at the end of the day, like, there is so much risk taking happening. There's so much of like the model that was set that new musicals that succeed are often the long shots. They're often original. They're often like the writers that are homegrown. And so people keep taking chances on those. There are so many more off-Broadway musicals than there were, 30 years ago. There's so much to celebrate and things go in waves. So I always feel like inspired and heartened by history, even during like the hardest times.
So then to that point, what's something you hope to still uncover or champion in your work?
That's a great question too. I feel like for me, there are so many lost musicals, and I'm not rushing to do them all tomorrow. There are shows that I love that I think not enough people know that I hope I'll be able to like be involved with pushing forward in one way or another. One of them, I saw a production of Smile the other day, directed by Rob Schneider, and I was like, it's just one of my favorite, like, lesser known musicals, but there are a lot of those. And I feel like there are so many musicals that the world, like, has forgotten that they would be so excited to remember. Honestly, having so many shows, my favorite musical of all time, Merrily We Roll Along, having this great comeback story. There are so many shows like that I think the world needs to see that, like, are from the past.
Wow, what a revival that was, huh? I mean, to state an obvious, really. I really taken. Anyway, okay, where can folks find your new book, and how can they follow you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm at Jen Ash Tep on all platforms. And my book is sold everywhere books are sold. But if you want to support a local bookstore here, there's signed copies at the Drama Bookshop, the Museum of Broadway, 54 Below. There's signed copies at all of those places, and the Dress Circle on 44th Street. And you can buy it wherever books are sold. I'm so excited to have like Untold Stories of Broadway being my first books in a series, and then like Women Writing Musicals being a hardcover. It feels like a big deal. I keep being like, oh my God, it's a hardcover book. But yeah, I just am so excited to have them out in the world and there.
Well, I grew up like you did, I'm sure, reading Ethan Warden's books.
Yes.
And, Second Act. I mean, all of them. I mean, they're all over my home, and going to the flea market every year. And like I had Paula Leggett Chase on the other day, and I was like, Paula, you don't know this, but I remember you from Curtains and Annie Get Your Gun, and I remember, because just like you, didn't matter she was a swing, I knew who she was, and you are not only have taken it in, but are recreating and paving a way for future us, Jen. And so personally, it means a great deal, and professionally, it means a great deal, because I think you are the torchbearer in a lot of ways, not just to stand alone, you know what I'm saying, but as part of our niche community, the torchbearer that's going to allow for this art form to thrive. So thank you.
That's very kind. Really. And I'm so grateful that we've gotten to have like experiences together over the years that have like aligned us.
I know.
That Sondheim concert, it really, like, it's legendary.
Listen, over several glasses of wine, I'll recount my full story to see if you think it should be a real book. Okay,
I do.
But before we go though, we have always said, I'm going to put you on the spot. We end with a comfort food performance, which is really just a performance we love, and that we would ideally like to come back to time and time again. And this is such a random. So I'll kick it off. This is such a random one. I don't know why it came up for me, but 2004 was a very formative theater year for me, as I imagine it was for you to some extent.
Definitely.
And that was Caroline O'Change, Wicked Avenue Q, and Taboo. And I saw Caroline O'Change and Taboo many, many a time. And Liz McCartney came on yesterday singing "Talk Amongst Yourselves" from Taboo, and I remember just sitting there in the theater, and I loved the whole show. A young Ewan Morton. I love the whole show, but Liz McCartney in Taboo is my comfort.
There are just so many. Like I feel so
know.
lucky to have gotten to see so many of them. I think, wait, is this question about something we saw that we need to see again, or like it can be something we didn't see?
It could be something that we didn't see. It could be a recording. It could be a book. It's like, what's a
Yeah.
performance that's for you
I have
present?
been thinking a lot about the original production of Last 5 Years recently, and about like the time machine.
Lauren Kennedy or Sherry Renee Scott?
Sherry Renee Scott.
Okay.
Although I love Lauren Kennedy too, but
Yeah.
because I think that, and I've been shocking people when I keep reminding them that the original Last 5 Years ran for 2 months at the Minetta Lane to empty audiences who weren't going downtown because it had just been 9/11, and like it was early 2002. And the fact that this show looms so large and is so important to all of us, and like has occupied this amazing place in theater history, as have Sherry and Norbert, as have Daisy Prince and Jason Robert Brown, and yet the original production, like it's that thing that is heartbreaking, and it's also so special. They knew how special it was when they created it, but it didn't get its like flowers in that moment, and it so like should have. And I would love to like teleport myself to the Minetta Lane in 2002.
Oh, well, kind of like you put out Songs for a New World, and maybe that was a little bit of a early Be More Chill, just in terms of the quality of its virality.
It's that, and Songs for a New World also, like that would be my second choice. It's that thing where it ran for a very short period of time. It went viral because of the cast album. Jason Robert Brown told a story at one point about how at one performance Elaine Stritch came, and there were like 10 other people in the audience, and so like it was just Elaine Stritch being like. And it's like these legendary shows that loom so large for people, they lose sight of the fact that like they weren't fully appreciated the first time around. And it's so exciting to think about being there for some of these moments. That's why we're so lucky to live in New York and get to go to the theater.
Period. Find Jen's book. It's great. Find all of her books and keep a lookout. Thank you for being on, Jen.
Thank you.